Okay, good morning and thank you all for being here. Technical difficulties, sometimes we can't get away from it. I'm going to talk today about establishing powerful learning outcomes. So research on cognition has suggested that students learn more when they know what is expected, and powerful learning outcomes help students to organize and direct their studies. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, like slide 2. Like Dee said, we're not experts in educational pedagogy. We're just enthusiastic about teaching and willing to share our ideas on how to teach well. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today are ideas that I myself learned through a course I took with the Association of Colleges and University Educators on a course on designing student-centered courses. Next slide, please. So let me start by providing a bit of context for the learning objective or the goal I'm using as an example today. It's from a chapter in my health economics course. I teach health economics both as a 16-week undergraduate session as well as an 8-week graduate session. My students are non-econ majors who are usually working on their bachelor's of science in healthcare administration or master's of healthcare administration. And the objective I'm going to be talking about today is one of about 4 to 5 objectives from a topic, or what you might call a chapter, of the market for health insurance, which I cover in about 1 week for my graduate students, or over 2 to 3 weeks for my undergraduate students. And it's usually towards the end of the semester. So before I dive in, I also want to provide a distinction that I generally view learning objectives as daunting, and it describes what should happen in the classroom or material to be covered. And I want to suggest what we're calling powerful student learning outcomes, on the other hand, as what describes what the student can demonstrate that they know and are able to do by the end of the course or the module or the program. So distinguishing between sometimes what we call objectives versus outcomes. In fact, when I first started teaching, I basically would just copy the learning objective straight from the textbook I was using into my course syllabus without giving it any thought. But over the years of teaching and taking courses on teaching pedagogy, I've learned to give my learning outcomes some more thought, just as Dai has laid out. So next slide, please. So today we want to discuss how to write powerful learning outcomes in 4 simple steps. The first step I want to talk about is that student learning outcomes should be student-centered, which basically means it describes the work that the student will be expected to do. And many of us are doing that in our course syllabus already. The next thing is to check that our learning outcomes, or what we've been calling our learning objectives, if they are observable and actionable. So this is to ensure that the students, what we're telling them they need to be doing, the learning outcome, that they can demonstrate mastery. We will see that in order to do that, to be able to write it such that the student can demonstrate mastery, we need to use action verbs and ensure that the work is measurable. So it's linking back to being able to assess them. A list of some of the action verbs will be provided in the next slide. Then the students' learning outcomes needs to be specific, because and not vague, because students need to know where to focus their efforts and their actions. And what do I need to learn? Students are always saying, what do I need to get an A? Well, if your learning outcomes are specific, they can know what to focus on. And finally, let's also ensure that our student learning outcomes are developmental, meaning that the students should be building their learning from foundational skills to higher order thinking. So some objectives or outcomes will be testing the foundational skills, while others will be more higher order thinking. Next slide. So this next slide shows the list of action verbs for writing powerful learning outcomes. Across, you will notice those action verbs on the left in red are the Bloom's taxonomy, from the foundational skills of remember all the way to higher order thinking skills of analyze, evaluate, and create. And this list are just what you can look at when you're looking at your learning outcomes to see if it describes it. This action verbs describes it better. And this is not an exhaustive list by no means. Let's go on to the next slide. And here I want to talk about one of the learning objectives for the topic for market for health insurance from my class. And initially my learning objective was to identify the information problems that leads to market failure in health insurance market. So I consider this a learning objective rather than a learning outcome. And what I want to walk us through today is, how do I turn this into powerful learning action? So the first step is make it student-centered. And a simple revision from that learning objective at the top of the page is basically just saying student will be able to, or student will. So you can say student, so what I'm changing is in the red. Student will be able to identify what students will do rather than the material you will cover. Putting an emphasis on the students rather than the instructor. Many of us, like I said, already do this at the beginning of our learning objectives, and then we list them. The next action, or the next step, when you're re-looking at your learning objective, is to use the action verbs. So you pick from the list provided and make sure that your verb is observable and actionable. So when I looked at my learning objective, I looked at the action verb there, identify. I looked at the list that I provided with all those different words. I can't seem to change that. I think identify serves as a good action verb for what I want my students to be able to do for this particular task. So that's why I'm showing that identify is my learning verb there. And that leads to, I'm still keeping that, market failure in health insurance markets. Then the third step, ensure that the outcome is specific enough for students to describe what they are expected to do. So in that step, I decided that just saying market failure may not be specific enough. And so I'm saying, I decided that the specific market failure that I want my students to focus on for the health insurance market are things like moral hazard, adverse selection, supplier-induced demand. So I went ahead and just put that there to say they will be able to identify information problems such as market failure, adverse selection. So that's what you see in the red. I want students who have done a good job of learning this outcome to definitely be able to remember, say, 3 to 6 months after the end of the class, what are some specific market failure in the health insurance market. And then the final step, which is step 4, determine if the outcome should be adjusted to ensure students are using higher order thinking skills. this step is the developmental stage, and we all know that learning is developmental. So the powerful learning outcome here will cultivate both foundational and higher order thinking skills, and also depending on your audience. So if you're teaching to undergraduates, are you teaching to graduate students? Are you teaching to people who are working and coming for, some certificate course? And so the foundational skills such as remembering, the action verb is identify here. So it's a foundational skill, all the way up to maybe analyze and thinking creatively. So I changed my objective here a little bit, my learning outcome, to students will be able to identify and discuss examples of information problems, like that. So let's go on. The next slide shows you the difference between what I'm calling my initial learning objective to what I've turned into. And I would suggest that my initial learning objective is broader, which I started with, and turned into a powerful learning outcome that I ended with. I'm sure that this is not perfect, my powerful learning outcome. It probably can still be worked on, but it's a step in the right order to help the student focus to know exactly one of the outcomes that they need to master or do or know in order to be successful in this chapter talking about the market for health insurance. So those